So thank you everybody for coming to this panel, which is all about how to lead developers, especially if you are not one yourself. And we're going to start, I'm Elisa Camahort-Page from BlogHer, but my previous life was in high-tech product line management. This is Susan Mernett, who has been everywhere from Yahoo and AOL to now running Oakland Local, her own company, and Sandy Jen, the co-founder of Meebo. And I'm going to let each of us sort of comment on our why we're on this panel, basically. And then we'll talk a little more. But this is an interactive session. Our format is very much about answering your questions and why you chose to come to a session about working with engineers and developers. To that end, we have Jennifer here in the front with a mic. We are recording this for the virtual conference experience, so do please wait for the mic. But we'll take questions and comments really almost at any time. The last little housekeeping note is that right after this session, lunch, you guys are lucky, there's going to be a lunch buffet line right there. They're going to open up the walls. There is a lunch panel with Moira Forbes moderating, 3 very impressive women talking about leadership. So go pick up your lunch and come back in. The walls will be opened up. So we are going to run absolutely on time. If you've been to BlogHer events before, you know that we like to do that. So that's just to kick it off. So I'll start with me, and then we'll just go down the row. I actually have a really checkered past. This is my 4th career, probably. None of which, I was a theater major and a vocal minor in college. All right, there's always somebody, right? How many of you, just out of curiosity, are doing now what you went to college to study? Wow, one per... I speak English. Oh. Excellent. So it's not so unusual to not have studied something that you end up pursuing, and I certainly did not. But I ended up in tech in 2007 purely because I had been working in another industry which was based geographically outside the Bay Area, and job pickings were kind of slim, and I really thought to myself, this tech thing seems to be really taking off, so maybe I should try to do that and see if I could do that. And I took a real backward step and went in and was an administrative assistant in a marketing department at a tech company. And then it was the late 90s, and if you worked hard and were assertive and did your thing, 4 years later I was the senior director of product line management at a hardware company for telecom companies. And in the process, I ended up managing not only product managers who were all, without fail, more technical than I originally was, but leading the priorities of engineering teams. And it was, certainly challenging in the beginning, but definitely learning how to work with those engineers and the engineering mindset was absolutely critical. And even now that I'm more on the internet side, and I don't specifically lead our developer teams, but still being able to articulate what you need, how you need it, and why you need it, and have that translate to the developers is really an important part of what you're going to do. Unless you're planning to do everything yourself, you're going to work with people who need to, you need to speak their language, and you need to know how to make a compelling case. And so that's my background. It's why I love to talk about this subject, because if I can end up leading teams of product managers and engineering without breaking into tap dancing, then anybody can do it. Susan, why did we invite you to be on this panel?
My last corporate job was at Yahoo. I was the senior director for product management and revenue optimization for Yahoo Personals. And in that job, I was responsible for leading the complete rebuild of what at the time was the world's most visited dating service, which had technology from 2004. So we had to come up with how we were going to do, $1 million renovation on the front end and the back end and tie it to quarterly business goals and quarterly objectives. And that was my job. My original degree is in creative writing. And, I felt like by the end of my time at Yahoo, I really could work with the team to write a spec and plan a strategy for pretty much any kind of product. And, I think that's really a lot of why I'm sitting here, because in addition to being someone who, is very analytical and very technical herself, I'm also someone who has a real passion for figuring out, how to bridge the gap to talk to lots of different kinds of people, including engineers, and it can be pretty challenging.
So, engineer, challenging engineer. Sandy, talk a little bit about your sort of trajectory.
Sure. So I am actually doing what I studied in college, which I guess is rare in this room. I studied computer science at Stanford, and the outcome at that point was I graduated in 2003, and it was when the bubble had burst, so it was dead. And I was helping TA some CS, like computer science classes, and by the end of my senior year, my classes were like 4 students. And when in the beginning, there were like 15 to 20. So the interesting part for me was when I decided to, pull the trigger and start a company, my learnings is kind of the flip-flop of what they did, was I had to learn how to speak the non-engineering language. So how do you speak to VCs and investors and partners, and how do you hire people who are not like you, who are not engineering, who were not brought up in the same type of training and thinking? So that was a really interesting experience for myself. And 5.5 years later, after we started Meebo, I'm no longer coding. I still do engineering, but I don't code, and I deal a lot with how to hire salespeople and marketing people and product managers, and how do I talk to outward people and external folks who don't know anything about Meebo. And so that experience for me has been very, very valuable and very interesting as well. So it'll be fun to kind of talk about the stuff that I've learned here.
So how many of you in here do the technical work yourself? The coding and how many of you work with outside developers? Okay, okay. Just wanted to check and see how many, if we had a lot of folks in here who were developers. So I'd actually like to start with you, Sandy, and we had an interesting conversation about the discipline of learning computer science and what studying that in college actually gets you as a way of thinking that's relevant. And I'll just tell my little anecdote and then toss it over to you. So when I first taught myself HTML, I don't know how many of you may have had this experience, but I got really frustrated with myself that I couldn't always remember how to do the resizing of images, the image source height with that code. I could never remember it for the longest time. I probably still couldn't remember it now. And I would always then have to go online, and you could Google it. It comes up in 2 seconds. But I said to my husband, who's a software developer, oh, I'm so annoyed. See, if I had gone to school for this, or if I was really doing this, as though I wasn't there typing HTML code, I would remember that. And he goes, you see all these books around my desk? And he goes, and you see that whole internet thing? I don't memorize every programming language I use, and I don't have every command memorized. I use references. I use resources. You are doing what an engineer does. And I was like, oh, I'm awesome. But it really changed my mindset. It completely flipped. I didn't know what engineers thought like, so I assumed I wasn't acting like one. And it really gave me a different level of confidence, but also it just totally took that nasty voice out of my head that I couldn't do something. So what is it that you learn in school that you think carries with you as a discipline of thinking?
I think engineering in general as a discipline is like, it's not like you have to be brilliant or a genius or whatever. The way you are taught is that everything is sort of a problem, and then you have to take methodical steps how to solve it. And so it's funny because, I'll talk to artists, and they're like, oh my God, what you do is so hard. Like, I couldn't do that in a million years. And I look at what they do, and I'm like, oh my God, what you do is so hard. There's no way in a million years I could do that. And so there's always this perception that the other person doing something interesting that you don't know how to do is a lot smarter, a lot more brilliant, a lot more, interesting than you are. And so I think the thing I realized after, working with engineers and non-engineers is that we all are brought up to think differently, and the way you're trained to think differently influences the way you speak, the way you communicate, the way you interact with other folks. And so an interesting anecdote, like similar to what Lisa was saying, is that we have requirements for a particular product. And in order to convince engineers that this is something valuable, you can't just say, we need to do this, it will make us this much money, let's just build it. You have to say why we have to do that.
And making money isn't enough of a reason?
It is a good reason, but they want to know, okay, well, what is this? What is the path that we're going to take? Where is this money going to go? How is this money translated? Like, how many? If we do an advertising thing, how is that translated into clicks and impressions and things like that? And so, if you go from the standpoint of a blanket statement and you say, here's how I'm going to convince you, that's not going to work. You have to give them reasons. You have to give them a logical path as to why we're doing a particular thing, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, totally, I'm on board, let's do it. And so I think part of it is just understanding from their framework of how do you integrate your goal or the thing you want to communicate and then just translate it into steps that are very easy for them to understand. Much in the same way that an engineer, while trying to explain how this piece of software works, has to break it down for someone who doesn't understand the actual ins and outs as well. So it's a two-way thing. And the common perception is that engineers are stubborn or they are headstrong and they're like, I don't want to do this because it doesn't make sense. But it's really not like that. I mean, there's some people like that in all fields. But in general, if you just go in a very logical manner, a very clear and concise sort of step-by-step reasoning of why things happen, then it makes things a lot easier.
But Susan, so I want to ask you, because isn't the reverse also true, that it's not enough for an engineer to tell you, but hey, we could develop this cool feature, and this would be, no one's doing this, and it's super cool technology, and it would be just awesome. That's like not going to be enough for someone running a system like you were to say, oh yeah, totally implement that. How did they have to speak to you?
So I used to joke about myself when I had this job at Yahoo, because I generally have a very positive, upbeat, optimistic nature, and probably 90% of my job was saying no, and the other 10% was deciding what order to do things in. So, I was like, no, we can't do that, no, we can't do that, and then, yeah, we can do those things, but we're going to have to do them in these little increments, one after the other, and it might take a year. And, I think that what we're really talking about is how do you find technical people that you can build a good partnership with? Because someone who's a good engineer who, kind of deserves or is qualified to work with someone who's not technical is someone who's actually going to enjoy the back and forth and enjoy the discourse. And some of the really great work I've done, both in big companies like Yahoo and Netscape, and in little companies like Oakland Local, has been with somebody who really enjoyed having that conversation. They didn't resent it. They didn't bristle. They wanted to have a discussion about what could we do and then what should we do. And the person who decides the should is the person who's responsible for the budget, which is probably a lot of you if you're paying the bills, okay? So, that's a really key part of having a good relationship with technical people, mutual respect, and a shared incentive to make decisions that ultimately don't just fit what they want to do because they think it's cool, but are really going to help you with your business and hopefully with your customer value. Hopefully everything you're building has real value for your audience and you've thought through why you want to do these things. And I just want to say that the flip side, is I think often people who are not technical don't have experience actually thinking through what they want something to be. And often it's like, I want this, this, and this, but what they really can't say is, well, what are the behaviors or reactions you want the user to be able to engage in? They're like, I want to build a really great website for moms. Well, how can the engineer read your mind to know what that means? Does that mean you want to build a mobile app that's a calendar, or does it mean you're going to have a video game that they can take a break with? So, it's very important to also be very sensitive to the fact that, engineers are basically people who are doing technical specifications, and it's your job to be clear enough both in terms of documentation and what you're writing and what you want, and then in discussion so that they actually understand what, it's like saying, I want a really beautiful house. Well, how about the architectural plans for that house, right? So that's where you need the mutual support, but you also have to be able to articulate what you want in a way that kind of fits into the way an engineer's been trained, as Sandy says.
So before we go to the question, I do just want to ask, how many of you work with developers or engineers where you own the budget, you hired them, you control who you're working with? And how many of you are working in a corporate situation or some kind of organization where you didn't choose the engineers, so you didn't choose how awesome they were to work with? So Michelle, you have a question.
Yeah, I am Director of Product Management at Edmunds.com, and so I've worked in a corporate product development environment, and like you were saying, I don't choose the engineers that I work with. They're assigned to my team and to my product, and I feel like I do a very good job of being detailed about with my business requirements and my product specifications, and I do very detailed use cases, I do wireframes, I think through every possibility. How do I get the engineers to read the dang spec? I mean, I've been doing it for 11 years, and that is no matter what the engineer, no matter what team I'm on, getting them to actually read the spec and follow my directions. No matter how I try to explain it, I'll do a verbal walkthrough, I'll send it in a Word doc, I'll put it on our wiki, I'll do it any way they want it, but I just cannot get them to read it.
Did the verbal walkthroughs help?
I don't think anything helps. I try to do it, I'll do it a different way for every engineer on my team if I have to, but I don't know, that's my biggest struggle, I think, with working with engineers.
I'll make two quick comments, and then I'm sure Sandy has comments too.
I do too.
So, with a big team, with a complex project like at Yahoo, we had project managers who were fantastic professionals at managing projects, and we spent hours and hours having multiple walkthroughs. We used a system called Scrum. We did agile product development. That was really fantastic. And, there were still people where you kind of want to shake them. I kind of had the opposite experience when I built Yahoo Oakland Local. Went from this big company to doing this little tiny Drupal site, and I wrote a 36-page spec for my own site, just like I would for a consulting client, because it's part of what I do in my consulting practice. And I gave it to my developer, and I realized about 3 weeks into it that my developer, who was someone I'd known but not worked with, was pretty dyslexic and didn't read. And I was like, wow, I don't think this person is reading my spec. What do I do now? And, I'm still working with this person almost 2 years later. I love him. But now I make PowerPoints with pictures. And I annotate the pictures. And that's how I give him a visual record of what we're going to work. In a big company like Yahoo, if you didn't have a detailed spec, you couldn't get in the door and have any credibility. For my developer, who's a small guy who wants to work with mission-driven nonprofits, he doesn't want to read that. He's much more about, something really visual and iterative. So I share your frustration, but I also think that, to your point, there are lots of ways to communicate that can all get you to the same place depending on the person and the culture of the organization.
Well, I'll say one thing, and then I'll toss it over to Sandy. There's also a cultural, I don't know what the culture is of the engineering department. I'm not saying this because I'm way proud of it, but in my last corporate job, I had to raise my voice and curse to be taken seriously. I know, shocking. I had to raise my voice and curse in meetings with multiple people around. That was the culture of the company. The leadership of the company did that. It was a volatile. I'm not saying this is every company. I'm just saying that this happened to be a culture where until I said, that's bullshit, you're going to build it like I wrote it, and I don't want to hear about it till you've done it. Come back to me in 2 weeks and tell me when you're delivering. Just like that. Just that hard, with the cursing, with the raised voice, and then they were like, oh, she's one of us. I don't like it. I'm very happy now to work in an environment where I don't think anyone from BlogHer would have ever heard me talk that way, probably, but that was the culture. So there's that issue, too, which is what does it take? What has been bred before you that you cannot take responsibility to completely change? I'm not saying that's what it is. I'm just saying, how do they interact? How do they get themselves to do anything? How does anyone in the department move forward? Can you observe anyone in the department who seems to get the engineers to do what they want, and what do they do? How do they speak to them? How do they demand things? How do they ask for things? You're asking in all the ways you can think of, so start asking in all the ways you see other people thinking of that seem to have a positive result. And so, Sandy, would you like to defend the engineer?
So I would say two things. What I found especially with younger engineers as well, is that if they're not passionate about the product that they're building, they're not motivated to work on it. And so if you can get a deeper connection with that engineer and say, look, I can read the spec all day, but if I don't like what I'm building, it's very hard to make them move. They'll just do kind of what they're told and just kind of finish it off like that. If you want them to do a really great job, you have to incent them to really get into that product or whatever they're building. So that's the first point. Second point is that, from what I found, like, it's not a stereotype, engineers hate documentation. They hate doing it, they hate reading it, it's really boring. But they're all about execution, so if I can just code something and I can get it out, that is so much more appealing than having to read a 36-page spec and be like, oh my God, 20 minutes later I haven't started yet. So the visual aspect is really nice because they can see it, they can grasp it in 2 seconds. They're like, okay, this is what I'm building. And if they say, oh, this is a little bit unclear, I will then go to the spec and say, okay, what does she actually want when she says this green box is a button? So that aspect actually helps a lot by giving them something quick and very, very easy to execute on. Makes it a lot easier to move fast on. Because, like, from me, from an engineer's perspective, I'm like, go, 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 go. I'm like, if I can just code it and get it done. Like, I did a 2-year internship as a high school student in a biology lab, and I had to wait like 3 weeks for an experiment to finish. I was like, oh my God, this is torture. Like, I can't wait that long. I want the results now. And so for an engineer, it's like I code something, I see the result in like 2 seconds. It's super satisfying. And so the wait and the kind of impatience is a little bit what's adding to the whole, like, oh my God, I have to read a 10-page spec to even know what I'm working on. And so if you can just kind of like simplify it, get it in a really digestible format, whether it's visual, 6 bullet points, a 2-page PowerPoint, that helps a lot.
And finally, do you feel like you have an ally in the engineering department at all? Someone who at least sees the frustration and shares it?
There are a few engineers. I've been at my company for 7 years,
Yeah.
so there are a few that I have really good relationships with that we've worked on several projects together. So yeah, I do feel like that. And I think part of the problem too, which is pretty common at internet companies, is that technology overtakes product. Technology has priority over product and gets maybe a little more respect within the organization, so that you need product to be able to drive the work, but when it comes down to, are we making this decision based on business and product, or are we making it based on technology and platform, technology tends to win out, and the engineers are very aware of that as well. So
that means the next session in this track is probably important about managing up,
Right.
Because definitely both tech companies I worked at over 7 years, it was founded by technologists, right? So technology was the thing, but you had to. That is not what makes them long-term successful, to go develop technology for technology's sake. So finding an ally in the upper management who will help you reorient a little bit and value the business and product case is also, so you're trying to find an ally in engineering and manage, across levels to get what you need, and also managing up to find some kind of champion who will help adjust that culture of technology being the winner.
I think that was good advice from the actual specs, because I think what I've been doing is I'm a writer too, so I like words, and I use the illustrations of the pages to maybe complement, to illustrate what I've written, but I should do it the opposite. I should focus on the visuals and then just use the words to supplement the visuals.
Yeah, emails to engineers, quick bullet points, small paragraphs, really good.
Maura had a question over here.
I have a question. It's kind of a very detailed question, but Susan, when you mentioned PowerPoint, I was so happy because that was my question. For years, I've been doing these really stupid, like the stick figure equivalent of a PowerPoint, and when I want to set up front-end pages, and it works for me, but I never knew if it worked for developers, and I never knew like, should I use clip art to detail just how detailed I want this to look? And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, if it's relevant to other people, if PowerPoint works for you, how you do it and how detailed you get. And
you're talking about like wireframes for a site?
Well, I think
not even as detailed as wireframes, even before wireframing. Okay. When you're like, this is what the end product that I want it to basically function as. How do you visualize that?
So I think everybody uses the tools that they have, and I'm not somebody who owns copies of Photoshop and Illustrator. I'm not proficient with them. But having worked for a bunch of big companies, it was sink or swim with PowerPoint. So I'm great at PowerPoint, which is not my favorite tool, by the way, but I'm really good at it. So, I think it's picking something you're fluent at. I had a startup where my business partner was great at Visio, and we used all kinds of visualization, Acture kind of tools to build prototypes. So I think you work with what you have, and, I think that you want to make a distinction between, well, how detailed do you want to get for you to see it and for you to imagine it? I mean, how detailed does it need to be for someone you're giving it to? And, I think the part of my mistake with that 36-page spec was we were building a Drupal site, and I really just drowned this poor guy in, way too much detail because I was really thinking more about trying to get my own ideas down on paper really thoroughly, and I could have cut it super way back for him. So I also like the real iterative idea that you're going to share different levels of a plan with different kinds of people, but kind of talk to your engineer about what you need. Now, as we're talking, I'm sort of wondering how many people in this room are really dealing more with people who are working on their CMS, and it's really more about CMS and apps or plugins, because I think that's a little bit of a slightly different conversation than someone who's actually building applications.
How many of you are developing websites and working with, HTML, CSS, CMS? But also apps. Yes. How many of the rest of you are dealing with apps? How many of you are dealing with a software application? More, yeah, okay. Yeah. So, what kind of visuals work in your experience, Sandy?
So what's interesting is it also depends on the type of engineer. So at Mebo we have generally two types. There's the front end and the back end. And back end engineers really just kind of deal with server-side code, and they don't. One of their common sort of
Can you explain front end?
Sure. Yeah. So front-end engineers tend to work with visuals, so like HTML, JavaScript, the front end of what the user sees. Mm-hmm. So things that you could tactically kind of feel and play with and sort of interface with. Back-end engineers tend to do server-side work where you never see what they do, but they do things like the database stuff, the stuff that stores the data, stuff that interface with the front end to make it work, but sort of in terms of a visual aspect, there usually is none. And so what's interesting is that back-end engineers tend to self-proclaim that they are not very good visual people, in the sense that they can't design interfaces, they can't design pretty, documents and pretty websites. And so whenever they see something really pretty, they're like, wow, that's really awesome. They have immense respect for that type of skill. And so one of the ways that at Mebo we sort of have engineers feel passionate or try to get them to buy into the product is we have a really nice visual of what it might look like. And so that when they see that, they're like, whoa, now that I see that that's where we're going to go, then they understand what their part in that story is, and they're like, well, we can make this work, and that front end is going to look freaking fantastic, and it's going to be fast, and it's going to be performant, and they're going to be like, oh, okay, because of the work I did back here.
Do you mock it up in Photoshop and give them?
We do a lot of mock-ups. We are fortunate enough to have a UX team, so a user experience team that has like a visual designer. And so we'll do, even if it's just a quick mock-up, even in PowerPoint too, our product managers will do this. Just something slick that just says, here's like a little pixels, and when you click on this thing hikes up, and this thing shows this, and here's the data that comes out of it. All the engineers are like, whoa, that's a really cool product, and they get really into it because they actually see what the end product's going to look like. If all they see is words, they can't visualize that. And then it's like, well, I'm just building this thing because they asked me to, and okay, whatever. But if they see the actual end product, they're like, oh, that's something I can actually rally towards. And so that helps a lot to have something so that they know where they're going.
Cool. Yeah.
Is it important to have
Wait. Sorry. I'm not being very good about making you wait for the mic.
I'm being impatient. I want my answer now. Is it important to have your front end and your back end engineer partner? Because they sound like it's important to have two people. So I need to have the vision. I need to communicate it visually, also have it in brief points of what I want to accomplish, get that communication across to my front-end engineer, but then also have my back-end engineer partner
Right. So
to the front-end engineer. Do those two need to be speaking?
So I'm just speaking from Eva's perspective, but
Yes.
a product team has a product, like a head product person, who then works with both engineers.
Okay.
There's engineering as a whole should be working together, because what you don't want is that one area or department feels like they're less valuable than the other. You want them all equally invested in making the product really good.
Okay.
And so then what happens is that the vision is then, imparted by you or, the product person. It says, here's what I'd like to see. Here's the goals I'm trying to meet. Like, I want to increase page views, or I want to create something where there's more community. I want to create social experience. And then the engineers are like, okay, got it. Let me show you how I'm going to build it. Because it's not the product person's job to explain how to build it. It's the engineers to tell them how to do it. But they have to be they have to be aligned, right? And so everybody has to feel like they have equal say, but at the same time, going towards the same goal. So as long as the vision is clear and the specs that you're creating is clear, then the engineer will be on board in general.
Is it
So-
unreasonable, sorry, one last question, to have that be one person, the front end and the back end engineer?
Definitely.
Okay.
So that's actually what I was going to say. If you're doing a startup, this configuration can have some real challenges with it. I mentored someone whose husband was a techie, and having a partner or a close friend who's technical can really help you. But for a lot of people who have a startup, they have to find a team. And what's challenging is one route that a lot of people go is to hire an agency, hire a company, hire an offshore developer just to produce something for you. And in my experience, that has a really high degree of failure, because often the communication and the expectations don't really match, and that work doesn't necessarily give you exactly what you wanted. On the other hand, finding a front-end and a back-end person to work with can be really hard, because a lot of engineers who aren't working in a bigger company like to be solo on projects that they work on. So, I had a startup that I was in Colorado trying to nurse along, and we had a back-end engineer, and we had a huge amount of trouble finding a front end. And yet they had to line up at the same time, and we didn't have a lot of money. And in retrospect, I think what I would have done is taken my $15,000 and given it to one of these companies that help startups and just had them manufacture a prototype. But the $15,000 was all the money we had, and we were trying to build a team. So we kept trying to attract a good front-end engineer to work with the back end. And I ended up just shutting the whole thing down and saying, we just really don't have the right people who are qualified to build this product. We'd gone from building kind of a community software to what was a messaging product. And I was like, I don't think I can really attract and keep the engineering team to build this second version. So even if I can raise money, why am I going to do this? It's just not going to play to my strengths. So, this is a really classic problem of startups where you may not want to go to a shop and have them produce it all for you, and yet finding the right people who are free, who, as Sandy said, are excited about doing what you're doing can be really, really hard.
Well, it's that whole question of founders, co-founders or hiring people and getting people to work on something, and what's their incentive. Is it a piece of the company, or are you paying them? And I'm a big believer in founders, as obvious, because you have an equal stake and incentive and passion, and you work together. But you maybe can't find the person who's willing to. Bootstrapping. I went through my life savings before we got funding. I'm not even being like hyperbolic. So it's a road to hoe. So finding people who will get in there in the trenches with you can be challenging. But if you do, you have an entirely different, I think, kind of relationship and team moving forward than just starting as a single person and just hiring people who will never, maybe I'm being hyperbolic now, who may never feel as strongly about it as you do, and who may never really be as passionate about it as you are. And maybe you guys can comment on that more. But I feel like starting with Lisa and Jory, and then, we had a couple of contractors starting in 2006, full-time contractors who became our employees 1 and 2. And, that was great, but we worked together, the three of us, just with kind of volunteerism help for quite a while. And that forged, that was, you forge something 6 years later. People always ask us, I can't believe you guys are all still together. And I'm like, you don't know. You were like, we were in the war together, man, you know? I don't know. What do you think of the hire versus partner?
I have to say it is difficult because as someone who doesn't know much about a lot of people in the tech industry, it's hard to find those people who are just as passionate about your idea. I get this question a lot. It's like, how do I find tech co-founders? And I never have a great answer because there's not an easy answer. I mean, going to events like this is great because you'll find people who have varied backgrounds. You can go to student events, things like that, to find those folks. Something practical that I've seen has worked in some cases is where you start out by yourself and you do hire like an external shop, like something offshore, to create a prototype or to create the first version. So then you have, like I said, the visual, and then you start to say, okay, here's my site, and then you start to talk about it, you network some more, but then you have something to show, and so if you actually do find someone who's technical who's like, wow, that site's really cool, or that product is really cool, how do I get involved? Then that might be a way to open the door, when otherwise you just didn't have anything in the first place, because you guys may not have the skill set to actually create the thing that you're trying to create. So that's I've seen that kind of work. Managing offshore or managing a separate team is a challenge. And so, not only do you have to deal with, distance or time differences, you have to be extremely concise and clear in what you're trying to create, right? Because they're looking for the spec and they're looking for all the instructions of what to make, and they're only going to follow that. And they have a given amount of time and a given amount of money, and after that, it's done, right? It's not. You're not building a team with that. I mean, unless you have plans to do that and have experience. And so that's a challenge as well. But if you just want to get something out there and just do something, get something launched, that's one option as well.
I think a real challenge if you're not technical, and this is a mistake I've made, and I'm pretty technical, is not necessarily understanding what the right skill sets are for a job. Mm-hmm. If you're dealing with blogging software and you want to customize a CMS, that's pretty easy for most people. There should be a large number of people who do that. If you want to build a kind of calendaring or messaging app that's really different than what anyone else has done, you want to do something unique with mobile, finding someone who really has the skills that they say they have, who wants to work with you, can be hard. And, I think that for me, going to technology-related meetups in cities where I've been living, going to events, Kalee's here from She's Geeky, where women in tech congregate, working your network on LinkedIn. You really have to be willing to get out there and talk to people because, anyone is going to make an investment of time. None of us work just for money. So if you're a technical person, and you're competent, it's just like being a writer. You could do lots of different things, So there's always a selling proposition that you have to, A, meet the right people, and then find someone who's actually compatible enough with you and with your idea that they decide, well, this is the place where I'm going to focus my attention. If they're only doing it because you're paying the most money of anybody, well, that's probably not you, and they're not going to stick around, right? So building the relationships and looking at it as a long-term. I'm really proud that my Oakland local developer is still with me, and that we're actually about to start a new project based on Oakland local, because it's much more typical for people to work with someone for a year and a half, and then there's a burnt bridge, and it's like, my developer's holding me hostage. We haven't been having an argument over like who owns the code or something. So it's also really important to think about, how do I be a good partner to somebody who might not be an owner in my company, but I'm paying, has a very important role that I value. And, that's a two-way relationship also.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have to be willing to share. Like, it might start out as your baby, but if you're going to really build it and make it big, you have to be able to really give a part of that to someone else as well, because they need to be incentivized and aligned in the same way you are. They need to feel just as passionate about it, and if you're not willing to share, and you just want to keep it all to yourself and you just want them to do the work, that's not going to work. And so you need to be able to kind of, build that team as well and be able to give part of you and part of your idea to someone else.
But this is where I will bring up the point that there are times when it's, no matter how little money you have or how little revenue or income you have, there are times when it's worth it getting professional advice, and getting lawyers to help you with these kind of contracts is critical. So yes, Lisa, Jory, and I did the first conference without any kind of anything in place. We just put our credit cards down and reserved a space and did it, but we sat down right after the conference, and when we decided to form a company, we went and got a lawyer to draw up our LLC papers right from the get-go. And inevitably, if I can think of any partnership or employment or other kinds of agreements that have not gone the way we perfectly imagined they would, it's because we thought, oh, this sounds pretty simple. I'll just write this up myself, or I'll just figure it out, or this is sort of like this other thing. We just recently hired someone in-house who has, she just passed the bar. She just got through law school, and she's our contracts kind of person. And oh my God, my life is so much better. Like, I was sort of a default person to review these things, but I'm not a lawyer or even play one on the internet. And just having someone whose expertise that really is, who can point out, well, this one line is sort of signing you up for X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, no, I did not know that. Thank you. I don't like that. And not to mention the credibility you have going out when you're working with other people. When you've redlined a contract and it's written in that lawyer language, it may not be right, but they totally respect that. It's just sort of like learning the culture of the engineers. Like, the culture of lawyers is that if it comes back to them looking like a lawyer actually lawyered it up, they don't argue with you as much. They're like, oh, yeah, they know what they're doing. Damn. And they'll go ahead and take more of your terms or take more of their terms out, which is more usually the case. So if you're talking about bringing someone on as a partner or bringing someone on in any of these respects, getting those agreements in place so you're protected, there are times when it's worth the investment. And protecting your baby is worth the investment.
A lot of cheap resources for people who are starting companies. Like, the Valley is great for that. They're like, lawyers will work for free, or will work for a small amount of money or equity or whatever to help you get started. There are a lot of resources around here to do that. So
there are a lot of people willing to do things for a little bit of equity because they'll take that's like, just like VCs, the vast majority of that doesn't work out for them. Like, they end up with nothing out of that. But all they need is one, to really work out well, and it's worth the model. So there are a lot of, not just lawyers, but other kinds of service providers who will explore that. But does anyone have any other questions before we keep talking on? Stephanie.
Okay.
Hold on, wait for the mic.
When you know you're talking to someone who knows more about a subject than you do, how do you phrase it so you're still in the leadership role when really, like, your inner 8th grade I'm a dork starts speaking up? Because that's usually when I get really flustered and be like, just do whatever you want, it's fine. And obviously that can't continue to happen.
I have this is my go-to advice for anyone, not just talking to engineers. Do not be afraid to ask the stupid questions. Because if you are willing to be the one who opens your mouth and asks the stupid questions, A, you don't actually know they know as much as you think they know. So you may not be as stupid compared to them as you think you are. B, they think you must be really, really smart if you're willing to ask such a dumb question. You must have so much, you're clearly confident if you would ask a stupid question. But I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in where I'm the one who said, okay, I'm sorry, we got to take it a step back. Can you go back and explain? And you see all these people who you felt should obviously know the answer, surreptitiously, like, writing down, oh, God, I didn't know what. We were just in a meeting about some sort of, I even forget what it is now, but the guy kept using this acronym. And I was just there sort of, it wasn't my area. This is at BlogHer. So there's a bunch of other people, and I thought everyone else knew what he was talking about. And I'm like, but I came from a hardware world. So he kept saying DSP, which is demand-side platform, but I kept thinking digital signal processing. So I'm like, I'm trying to figure out how that is relevant. Digital signal processing could be relevant to this conversation, and my brain was just ready to explode. So I'm finally like, okay, I got to just ask because this is not my area. What is a DSP? And he says demand-side platform, and I saw almost everyone else in the room kind of going, and I'm like, no, So ask the questions. It's your money. It's your project. Ask the questions. And if you have the confidence to ask the questions, that actually comes across as strength. That's my opinion and some of the most important in my career, which has always been about learning on the job.
I also think it's important to be able to signal to someone whether you're looking for an answer or you're looking for options in a discussion. I've had thousands of discussions with engineers where they've said, we're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. And I said, well, that sounds really interesting. Is there another way to do it? What are some other options that you've considered? And usually, being methodical, people will say, oh, well, we also thought about doing it this way. and any others? I only thought about doing it that way. I mean, I'll say, well, you know, one of our big problems is we only have this much budget right now. So I kind of like a solution that would let us do X. Which of those do you think is actually the best fit? So I've just reshaped the discussion a little bit by providing more information about some of what my criteria are, which might be like time-based, it might be budget-based, it might be like assured outcome-based. And, you know, then this person's like, oh, well, here's another way we could do it. And, you know, with Yahoo Personals, the only way we could do this massive redo of a platform that there was no money for was to tie each release to some consumer-facing product feature that we were going to release where this back-end improvement. So, you know, the engineers came in and said, we got a great plan, it's going to take 18 months. And I said, ha, 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 ha. That's really funny because you think Yahoo's going to pay for 18 months of us not shipping product? I don't think so. Let's talk about what the alternatives are. You know, and that's a great non-confrontational way to get someone to be your partner. Well, what are the other options? What else have you considered? How are some other ways we could do it? And people are usually very willing to share that. And if they're not, then you should ask why.
Also, a lot of times the person you're talking to may not know that you don't know something. And so if you just stay silent, they're just going to keep going, and they're going to add more things. And so they're assuming something, and you're assuming something, but both of you are too afraid to say, I don't know what you're talking about. And so what you can do is you can say, okay, hold on. Let's start from the beginning. Explain to me what this is. And they'll be like, oh, okay, I didn't know you didn't know that. Let me explain it to you. It's just more about informing them and not going under the assumption that they might know more or you might know more, because you might have a really great perspective that they didn't consider. But because both of you are like going under the assumption that you know this and you don't know that, then you just kind of keep going down this hole, and then it's too late after the end of the conversation, and you both come out thinking two different completely things.
Right. And not making the assumption that they're going to judge you for not knowing that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, that's really, really important. So we have a question back there, Khalid, or a comment.
I was going to add, I think, you know, when I started out, I knew nothing about technology. Now I'm an expert in my field, and mainly it's because every time somebody says an acronym I don't know, I'm like, what's that? But you have to do it in a way that doesn't, you can't be like, oh, I don't know. It's just like a matter of fact. And people in different areas of technology, like Geo has its own little universe of language.
What's Geo?
Great question. Right. So geolocation.
No, I was serious. You mean like location-based
geolocation
stuff? Yeah, okay.
versus like, you know, mapping versus, and so every time you go and visit like a new technology land, they have their own vocabulary. You have to learn it. And they're very used to like new people wandering into their universe and trying to orient themselves who are technical themselves.
Right.
So just ask. You know, and if you need to, I mean, it's not like you want to interrupt a major meeting and be like, what is every word? You kind of keep a list, and then you go ask your friend who was in the meeting, okay, now I need you to explain these 4 things they went over that I didn't get.
Cool. That reminds me of the first time I went to South by Southwest. BlogHer had a meetup. It was in 2006, and I was only a couple years outside of the telecom and networking business I'd been in, and a woman, Swirl Spice, I don't know how many of you know her, but anyway, she was wearing a T-shirt at our meetup, MPLS. Well, that's a networking protocol, multi-protocol label switching. And there was a brief period of time where I was sort of an expert on that and would go give talks on MPLS. I can't actually tell you anymore what it is or how it works. That's how you have to push things out of your brain to make room for the new. So I went up to her and I went, oh, MPLS, are you in the networking, you know, whatever? She's like, Minneapolis. I'm like, oh, never mind. So yeah, you know, yeah. We still that's still like every now and then when I talk to her, we'll be like Minneapolis, yeah, awesome. Anyway, any other questions or comments or any other solutions that you've found? We've talked a lot about how we've worked with engineering. Maura.
Sorry. So I guess my question is, how do you know if you're hiring folks, you're not getting ripped off when they give you hours estimates and you don't know how long it takes to do all this stuff?
That's hard. Just what I found, engineers, even like the ones that I work with, hate estimating time.
Totally hate it.
They suck at it. They don't like it because it's hard to do. In general,
because it's a creative endeavor for them. For them, it's like saying, "When's your novel going to be finished?"
Right.
Isn't it?
It's a path. It's a problem. It's like I don't know how long it's going to solve it. And so, in general, I think you would work by history in a way. Like if they took 10 minutes or 10 days to do one thing and you think that's sort of similar, or just have them walk you through what they did, right? If they can't walk you through all the steps they took to do it, then they probably didn't take very much time, right? And don't let the excuse, oh, it's too complicated for you. No. Make them walk you through it, because they should be able to communicate that well enough if they're asking for payment, right? Like they need to know that they're actually giving you the value that you're paying for. But it's a difficult thing. Like even in large companies, and you ask an engineer, seasoned engineer, how long is this going to take? They're going to be like, do you really want me to tell you? I don't know. I don't want to do it. Is there any way I can give you something else? The other thing you can also ask them to do is to break it down into tasks. So you say, here's a big problem, and you say, okay, here's a big problem. How long is it going to take? They'll be like, I don't know, 70 hours. That's a huge problem with a huge amount of time. Instead, you can say, can you break it down into 20 tasks, or can you break it down into things that might take you 1 week. So this week I should see this week I should see this week I should see this. And then you can say, okay, well, then I can kind of measure how much you've done and how much I should pay you. Because if they can break it down for you, then it's a little bit more measurable for you. And then, that also helps them frame the problem, and they can be like, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize it was actually 20 tasks. It might take me a week per task, something like that.
Well, also use your network. You know so many people who have done development work. I mean, worked with engineers. Run it by some people.
I also think that it depends on what you're asking them to do and how you set up the agreement in the beginning. If it's something where you want them to build something very discrete, you probably want to get an estimate and a guarantee that it's not going to overrun past a certain percentage. Mm-hmm. It's going to take me between this, and then you want to see proof. If it's someone that's doing regular work for you on an ongoing basis, I think you ultimately want to try to find someone who's pretty honest and who values the relationship enough. So we have a developer who was working on a mobile site, and the guy spent like 30 hours doing this project, and 20 of it was because he was stuck. And we actually brought in another person with more mobile experience to help unstick him. And this is someone who works with us regularly, and he said, I just feel really bad. I don't want to charge you for all that time because I didn't really know what I was doing, and I know that you don't have all that money, so how about if I bill you X? And I was like, I really appreciate that. And I was able to say that because I pay this person every month. If it was, I didn't feel bad because I was like, I know that over time I'm giving him a good living, or, part of a good living. But I really appreciate that he's not just charging me for all those hours that, we didn't get anything. Wow. So it's really kind of like, is it someone you have a relationship with, or is it like a project?
Well, and I have a good sense. What like a basic Drupal website costs, but when you get into apps and all this new stuff, like apps, I feel like people are charging.
Comparison shop, multiple bids, RFPs,
always
your friend.
Multiple bids, yeah.
Yeah.
And we also, BlogHer, but before, when I had made my first website for my consultancy, and I'd never worked for myself before, the web developer had to learn something new to make something work for me, and he didn't charge me for a bunch of that time because that was him learning a new skill he was going to need, and he didn't charge me for the learning. He charged me then for the executing just for me.
There will be calibration too, just because if it's a new space, like mobile's still really hot and new, and so we get different varying ranges of experience, and so they'll have different rates, and so you'll kind of like swing one way and kind of swing another way, and then eventually you'll kind of find a good balance of what you think is reasonable. But there's no nice linear
magic
rate that
number.
Just happens. Yeah.
The other thing you can do, which kind of is the puffery giveaway, is say to somebody, well, what are you basing your fees on? Like, how are you, if you haven't worked with them, what are you, and they could say, well, this is what I always charge, or, well, this is pretty customary for, and see what their explanation is of why they're coming up with those numbers. And that'll give you some insight as to, well, do you think those are good reasons or not?
Yeah. Any other questions or any other solutions that we have not mentioned that you guys have worked with, that have worked for you in dealing with development teams, engineering teams, product? Yes. Is it Anne?
Yes. I'm actually a developer, and I've been for many years doing custom development for clients as well as my own business.
Is it lies, all lies, what we're saying?
No, it's exactly true. It's exactly true. And I just had two thoughts that I encourage my clients to tell me when we're talking about custom development. One is to think big, Not just what they want immediately, but in the long run what they want, because then as I'm developing, I'm thinking, okay, eventually they want to do this, this, and this, so I'm going to leave the doors open for that. It might help me chart my course through a very narrow scope and a tight budget to keep an idea of what's out there. And the other thing is about costing and pricing. Ask the developers, what are the points where they might run into trouble? Do they anticipate a technological problem, a scope issue, some other kind of problem that's going to be a snag ahead of time? And then make sure that there's regular communication along the way. So you don't want to get to the 30 hours into the problem to find out that 2/3 of that was an issue, but along the way, getting a lot of communication about that. I think that developers will be much happier working in that arrangement as well when they know that it's totally okay to say, hey, I just hit a snag, I didn't expect this, I thought this, all the stuff I read about this new technology said this would be easy, it's not. I need help, or I need another way to think about it. That'll all be really helpful as well.
That's great. Any other great advice? Any other developers out there that want to give us the secret? To be the developer whisperers?
The other thing I think is really classic, everybody will laugh, but food is a great token of appreciation.
That's true.
When I worked at Yahoo or in big companies, it was like bring the brownies. And my current developer is a very health-conscious vegan who I really love. I think he's wonderful. And I made a special dinner over the holidays for him and his partner. It was like, I want you to come over. I want to make you a dinner because I think you're so great. And, that kind of trying to have a relationship that's not only based on work, if you actually have those feelings, goes a long way because ultimately, as Sandy said, you're trying to do a project together where hopefully it's going to achieve something really good, right? And you want them to share that endeavor with you.
So we're at the 5-minute mark. That's what that little alarm was. Any other questions we didn't answer, solutions we didn't offer that you've tried, you use? Anything at all? I will say my one last thing is that engineering sometimes can be literal. Like I'll give you a very specific example. There was, we just launched a new conference website, and on the left-hand side there's all the conference names, and then past conference posts, blog posts. And on the right-hand side, there's a headline and excerpt from the conference blog post. So it's good to have information in multiple places, but you didn't have the more underneath the blog posts. So you couldn't see that there was more information happening. And we talked about it, and they were going to add it. It still had gotten added. And I said, it's such a bad user experience to not let them know there's more information. And I used some dramatic language, and I was accused of being a little dramatic. And because they said, look, it's over here on the left-hand side, conference post. It's the same exact link as you're asking for over here. It exists on the page. That information is there. Do not tell me I am not giving your users this information. It is there. And I'm like, but you are asking them to be drawn over here by the little pictures and headlines and more interesting information, and then somehow find some reason to come over here. So I had to walk them through. Here's what the user will do. They will come over here. This draws their eye. We've made it to draw their eye. And they will have no reason to come over here, and they will have no reason to know that what we're saying, conference posts over here, would be equivalent to a more link over there. So it wasn't enough for me to say, obviously we need it. It's a user experience issue. Blah, blah. I mean, I just sort of, and then they were like, oh, yeah, totally right. Awesome. Thank you. And it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. Sometimes you need to be reminded that just because you say so, nobody wants to do anything just because you say so. They want to be walked through. Both on the business side, when an engineer is telling you why to do something a certain way, and on the engineering side, when you're trying to tell them why you need something for your customers. We all like to be walked through the rationale.
I think a really good piece of advice just in general is that just don't assume because you're a developer or an engineer they think a particular way, or they might say a particular thing, or you're smarter or they're smarter. Just walk in with no assumptions. And if you are unsure about something, just ask. And so if both sides come in with no assumptions, then it's like, okay, we're on equal ground, and there's not sort of these weird miscommunications that happen all the time. So I think that's what happens a lot.
That sounds like good advice for life in general, probably.
It works really well with engineers. just lay it out. Just say it how it is.
Yeah. Shall we be first in line for lunch? Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you, Sandy and Susan.
Thank you, guys.
much.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you for
helpful.
coming.
Oh, gosh.
Hi.
Hi, Cynthia. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. I saw you at the door. Yes. Very helpful.
Good.
Very good. Thank you for making it open just to ask questions and to
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
quiet that little stupid.
Hi.